It is a great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. G.S. Sahota, Associate Professor of Literature and Sarbjeet Arora Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Sahota is a specialist in post-colonial studies, in cultural studies, in Indian literary and intellectual history, and especially in Urdu, Sanskrit, Punjabi, Hindi, and English. And he is the author of the book, Late Colonial Sublime, Neo-Epics and the End of Romanticism, published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. And his talk today is titled Philology of Another Future, Revisiting Ernst Trump and German Orientalism. As a reminder, we'll begin in just a second. We aim to go for about half an hour with 15 minutes of Q&A. And at that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sahota.
All right, thank you very much. Nilesh, really wonderful to be with you. And it's a great honor for me to be included in the series. Just presenting some fairly preliminary work. And so what I've done is just kind of sketch out some steps of an argument. I know time is short, so I'll fill in some of the details and maybe try to cover some of the gaps as we move along. And I'll maybe take cues during our conversation to sort of do that work of patching things up. So I want to just lay out some basic vocabulary that might be useful. One term that's in the title is philology, which is thought to be the least sexy of fields in the humanities, but it's made a bit of a resurgence. And I think there's probably good reason for that. And so maybe a definition of philology and how it's being deployed here may be a good place to start. For Nietzsche, who's being referenced in the title of my talk, who came up with the notion of a Zukunftsphilologie, philology of the future. Philology is the practice of slow reading, langsam lesens, or practice of langsamen lesens. And it's thought to be a way of reading that is freed from the constraints of the modern domination of time, or modern domination of us by time. And to quote him, of haste, of unseemly and immoderate hurry-scurry, which is intent upon getting things done at once, unquote. I think the term philology has sort of been at times very wide and capacious and other times very narrow in scope. And I'd like to return to Vico and sort of returning the term back to something which is a bit transdisciplinary. And so philology for Vico comprised not just, quote, the awareness of people's languages and deeds, but also the science of everything that depends on human volition. For example, all histories of the languages, customs, and deeds of various peoples in both war and peace, unquote. So you get a very broad sense of what it could include. And this has implications for a wide-ranging intellectual historical approach that works against artificial disciplinary distinctions of thought practice, institutions, and material relations. And the focus on will is somewhat significant here, because that gets us into an engagement with a question of hegemony, of authorial/authoritative practices that do the work of guiding others by one's own will. So I think of philology as a practice of authority, of authorizing, and thus of hegemony, a practice which is simultaneously a hermeneutics of a kind of hegemony, as it can be gleaned from signs, language, and texts. And I should tip my hat to an old professor, Sheldon Pollock of now Columbia University, who also wants to provide some kind of conceptual basis for a counter-hegemonic philology. And to quote him, it is by nature methodologically and conceptually pluralistic, because part of making sense of text, as he writes, is learning how others have done so, and often done so very differently, which makes philology inherently comparative as well. And so, lastly, we have Edward Said, who made a return to philology in an essay of that title late in his career. And he talks about philology as the basis for a kind of humanistic resistance, an effort that marks a transition from one area of study to another, from one realm to another, from one form of authority to another. And so you can see that this somewhat dust-laden field has implications for counteracting various trends that we might see, say, in the work of a figure like Ernst Trump. So I'll turn to Ernst Trump. And Ernst Trump is a difficult first person to study, and it's taken me some time to find sources on him. I've found his funeral oration, the Grabrede, online, and I've ordered a copy of Annemarie Schimmel's Ernst Trump, a brief account of his life and work from 1961 from the Library of Congress here. There seem to be only about 4 or 5 copies of this work in our catalogs. And so it's a very rare occasion to be able to kind of get into his life and what his trajectory was. It's fascinating to think what kinds of impacts he had in just a fairly short lifespan. So maybe it's useful to just kind of sketch out his biography or key moments of it, and then turn to one which is not really all that well covered in this book, but which is, I think, of relevance to all of us here. So this work by Annemarie Schimmel emphasizes his relation to Sindhi and Islam, to the things that were sort of fellow to the world of Pakistan, and has less to say really about Sikhism. But I think if you go back into the sources, into his works around Sikhism, you could, start to sketch out that other dimension of his oeuvre. And this work has a very apologetic tone. It writes that he was a child of his century, and above all, a missionary. So we get a sense of maybe what that milieu was like, what it was like to be a child of the 19th century. It's fascinating to think that Ernst Trump grew up in the province of Württemberg, which is connected with Martin Luther and the Reformation. He grew up in a family of very pious followers of Lutheranism. And early in his life, he came into an encounter with gypsies. This almost seems worthy of, say, a Zebaldian kind of rendition of his encounters with otherness. And these gypsies really sort of piqued his interest in other languages. And he immediately, after having gotten some introduction to German grammar and maybe a smattering of Latin and Greek, was driven to record the grammar of this language. So already something like a kind of orientation towards otherness was underway. Later, on account of various sorts of developments in German politics, which didn't suit him also well, he ended up moving to London. There he became an assistant librarian of the East India House under the good auspices of Sir Edwin Norris, and started to familiarize himself right away with modern Indian languages. And this was a major kind of breakthrough. Most of German Indology revolved around antiquity, and Ernst Trump seemed to have a kind of inclination towards the modern, which obviously would make a huge impact later. As, say, during his first journey to India in 1954, where he was welcomed by Mountstuart Elphinstone, then governor of Bombay, and Bishop Harding, who consecrated Trump as priest of the Anglican Church. and went to Karachi on a second visit in 1856, just before the Great Rebellion of 1857. And it's a little unclear how many times he went to India. According to some accounts, there are 4. I've been able to actually trace 3 that are for sure in the record. But he goes back and forth. He goes into other areas of the East, Palestine in this period. He has a child while the rebellion of 1857 is underway. When he goes back to Germany, it's to Stuttgart, and there in Villingen, his name is engraved on the memorial tablet in the town's St. Martin's Church. So you can see a kind of relationship with the church, with missionary activities, with Orientalism as a burgeoning field, the 19th century, and with the politics of colonialism. All of this is happening somewhat simultaneously. And it's in 1870 that he goes to the Punjab, probably for the 3rd time now. And on this occasion, he's commissioned by the British government to produce a translation of the Adi Granth, because, quote, the Sikh religion was a politically important factor in India. So you sense certain sorts of colonial imperatives at work here. After that, he returns to Munich, or returns to Germany, and is appointed professor of Semitic languages at Munich. And I'll talk about how the East is so capacious, sort of includes so many different civilizations, even moments of time. And in the early 1880s, he begins to experience blindness. And after the onset of blindness, he actually comes to the end of his life in 1885. So we could say that by the 1870s, if not earlier, we can see that Trump has begun to reveal some general characteristics of Orientalist practice, and allows us to work through some presuppositions and prejudices. Something like an Orientalist methodology is at play here. And so let me just lay out what this methodology looks like, or what maybe some major facets of it might be. And this is in no order of priority, but you kind of get a sense that there's a logic at play here. So he's definitely working within pre-given typologies. There's a quasi-positivistic naturalism regarding species and their categorization. And so we hear, phrases like the Indus country, quote, fell a prey to the wild fanaticism of the Islamized Arabs and thus remained excluded from the development of Brahmanic culture, unquote. And what the commentary here reveals is a connection between racial categories and collecting practices. So occasionally he comes across somewhat mysterious groups such as Kafirs, and comes face to face with 3 people from Kafiristan. And he's basically thinking of each one of these persons as a kind of representative of a racial typology. And he's starting to classify different languages according to pre-given categories, Indo-European, Semitic, and so forth. This will lead to various kinds of quandaries. 2, you see that he sort of assumes the prerogative to intervene in the sphere of language, devises scripts, he canonizes them to divide up languages, religions, and peoples into discrete types. And so we see, the impacts of this right away. He's intervening in the world of Indian languages and breaking up unities into what may become mutually exclusive groupings, each attached to a different script. So that has all sorts of implications. 3, there's a reading practice that he's associated with, a kind of aversion, even odium, regarding Indian poetry and works of religious significance. So you see a Lutheran antipathy regarding mysticism. He considers the whole field of mystical literature and poetry as something like a book closed to him. And we get a common sort of denigration of the approach of so-called natives. You can come across phrases like the common people enjoy nothing but jingling rhymes and play of words in which logic is often sacrificed. This is a kind of recurring refrain in his writings, a kind of disregard for jingling rhymes. And you know, you get sentences such as, the language abounds in grotesque symbols and so forth. And with respect to the Adi Granth, Schimmel writes, he had no interest in the religious content or the poetical beauty of this work. So general aversion towards all things, you know, poetic and so forth. And this leads to how he reads these works. So he reads in a way to really abstract. He abstracts text from the lived context and gives them precedence over the living reading practices that surround them and which imbue them with meaning in any given context. So you get a sense of a fairly commonplace reading practice whereby the task is simply to devise a grammar that would allow you to read a whole slew of texts without any kind of guidance of, say, native scholars, and you would displace the authority of the native scholar. This is fairly, you know, standard Orientalist practice that Barnard Cohn, as well as even A.J. Arbery, writes about. And then I think one last thing to maybe mention in terms of his methodology is that with his appointment of as professor of Semitic languages in Munich, he seems to think that the entire Orient is made up of a kind of fungible nature. You know, all the East is fundamentally one, its parts are interchangeable. It's very vast, but you can start to sense that a certain trouble starts to kind of to arise at this moment. You know, it's as if this term, the Orient, encompasses things that are so wide-ranging that one comes across facets of it with which one identifies, say, Indo-European languages, categories that pertain to oneself just as much as they pertain to another. And you see what something kind of setting into place here is scene of ambivalence. And you see a kind of identification, valorization, imputation of oneself and one's own culture into the substance of what one is interpreting. So curious interplay of difference and identity is taking hold at this moment. And so we see this in all sorts of ways. He starts to categorize Pashto as a member of the Indo-Germanic family of languages, and starts to even sort of wax a little bit poetical, even praiseful regarding Pashto. And with respect to, say, various communities or ethnicities, he starts to kind of associate them with Western ethnicities, such as Jats, who are now thought to be kind of remnants of the Goths. And so we start to see a kind of identification with certain sorts of facets of the East. And so we can maybe explore what the ramifications are of these sorts of categories of identity. And this is something that I've been kind of working on a bit, the German connection with India and vice versa, major points of kind of identification. And in the German context, we come across something which is a fairly gaping lacuna in Said's work, which is an orientation that allows for identification between East and West. It's thought that, in the early 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century with the German Romantics, that the German people themselves originated from Kashmir or somewhere out there in the East. And this is thought to be the Urheimat Asiens, right? The Asian original homeland of the German people. And this seems to kind of get reiterated in various ways, a kind of identification in the writings of Goethe with Hafiz, Schopenhauer with Indian sages, Nietzsche with Zarathustra, Zimmer with goddess Shakti. And I've been interested in this kind of problematic identifications, or maybe even productive identifications at times. And so we might ask, what are the implications of establishing identities across these divides of East and West, metropole and colony? And here, Schimmel kind of hints at this happening in various ways, but we see it as well. So leaving aside Schimmel, we can sort of move into the writings around Sikhism. And here we have the work from the early 1880s, Die Religion der Sikhs, the religion of the Sikhs. And I'll, for the sake of time, just jump over the German, but give you my little translation, which is right off the first paragraph from this work. And I've looked at other sort of moments of it to think, how is he translating? What kinds of interpretive schemes is he bringing into play vis-a-vis Sikh scripture, the Janam Sakhis, even just a kind of general mindset? And so my translation is here of just the first paragraph. And nearly the same time in which the West was awakening from the long slumber of the Middle Ages, the spirits of the Far East also began to stir. And only 14 years before Luther would a man there be born who would become the originator of a spiritual movement for his fatherland, which still remains effective up to the present day, even if in terms of reach and success, Umfang und Erfolg is not to be compared with the Reformation. So he makes a kind of equation between Nanak and Luther that I think will have certain sorts of wide-ranging ramifications. So despite the qualification at the very end of that sentence, or that what I quoted, we have a comparison between Nanak and Luther, Sikhism and Protestantism. And we start to see, even in major works, that we start seeing that Sikhism, in its early phase at least, is akin to something like a Protestant trend within Hinduism. And I want to just maybe explore that a bit and think about what the impacts were of this over, say, the following decades, over, say, a 20, 30, 40-year stretch of time. And here, let me just kind of lay out just kind of schematically some of my findings. And some of this is actually reflected in the work of Arvind Palmander, who's done an interesting work on questions of translation, which bring Trump into play with, say, figures like Jodh Singh, who wrote Gurmati Nirnay, treatise on the Guru's philosophy in 1932, and works that preceded that. But what we find is it's kind of confusing of categories. We find this in various ways. Is it a Protestant form of Hinduism, or is it a separate kind of religion entirely? And I think this whole set of problematics force various hegemons or leaders of Sikhism at this point in time, now we're talking about turn of the century, into thinking about religion according to the terms and terminology of Trump's framework. This is something that you find discussed in Mander's work, and you can see it in this line here regarding Jodh Singh's Gurmati Nirnay, which is described as reproducing a Christian schema not dissimilar to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, for representing key ideas of the Sikh gurus in short and easily reproducible form. And here now we get a sense of that sort of colonial hegemony having worked all the way through the actual institutions of colonial rule into various spheres that are in many ways, beyond it. And that's exactly what you can say hegemony does. It's sort of a production of a scale of forms where all things kind of conform with what is sort of hegemonic all the way down. And here, I'll sort of skip some of these for the sake of time, just skip over some of what I quoted from Munder's work, and maybe think about what, just what he's talking about is a conversion that's taking place into the time of modernity, where the present of, say, various figures within the Sikh community are coming into contact and being incorporated into the historical present of the Orientalist narrative. And so this leads to all sorts of problems. What kind of philology can we imagine that might sort of push things beyond this framework? So another future, and this last section we call something like working with the bad new things, following Brecht's preference for the bad new things rather than the good old ones. And we might think, what kinds of cues could we get from the historical record for rethinking reading practices? We might just look right at the preface from Trump's Adi Granth translation, where he writes, quote, "It was finally arranged that I should go myself to the Punjab in order to work first with the Granthis, the German is kind of in the English, in order to work first the Granth through with the aid of some Sikh Granthis. And I started therefore for India towards the close of the year 1870, in the expectation that all difficulties would be easily surmounted there. But after I had succeeded in engaging 2 Sikh Granthis at Lahore, I was not a little surprised when they declared to me that the Granth could not be translated in the literal grammatical way I desired. And this may be actually really sound advice, right? To not do it so literally, to think about, what the range of connotations might be that far sort of exceed what is literally given. And so there may be some kinds of missed opportunities to rethink for a post-Orientalist philology. And what are some of these alternatives? I'm sort of rushing through, but I think hopefully I can kind of get through just a little bit more. Don't mind. Stop me if you need to. What are some of the alternatives and what could they spell out for a kind of future philology? There could be a kind of alternatives at the level of selfhood, to not conform to, say, the liberal notions of individuality and notions of selfhood that Trump had brought into his work. Alternatives at the level of the collective, to not be determined by the colonial divisions that are being imposed by figures like Trump. Alternatives at the level of spirit, to not allow an enclosure by writing notions of religion as a pre-given category imported from the metropolitan realms. And so this, there's a little bit of a coda here, and I'll just conclude with this, that, go back to Benjamin, who had an interesting idea of what philology could do, kind of giving us not just very general frameworks, but a kind of precise understanding of terminologies and the terms under which various types of authorities are being put into place. And this deals with sort of thinking about the human, and here we know that for those deemed less than human in the age of imperialism, the question of the human must necessarily remain open. The terms they bring into work against foreclosing the question of the human and keeping it instead an unfinished, interminable project, I think is central. And it's a project which defies the current terms that we even bring to it. So this is a kind of philology as a knowledge that makes us aware of the terms of our times, a way beyond the divide that philology may allow, a way that we can glimpse through philological practice. And this is maybe just a way of thinking that through philology, alternative kinds of authorities might be in the offing. So I'll leave it there. That's just a kind of sketch of a very broad kind of argument that's at play here. So I'll turn it to you and see if there are any questions. Maybe I can fill in some of these gaps.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think I will start by asking you to perhaps say a bit more about the effects of this translation on the world of Sikhs as they started to develop a sensibility around religion as a discrete object. And if you could comment a bit about the significance of this moment for that history. And the students in the class had read work by Michael Brunner around the Khalsa College, and there's a mention of how this moment was extremely significant for how different contestations emerged afterward around some of the questions that you mentioned. Is Sikhism to be seen as a version of Hinduism, a Protestantized version of it? Is it to be seen as something separate, coherent, and unified? Could you speak a bit more about that significance related to how Sikh intellectuals and other figures started to perhaps go in different directions, or how it impacted Sikh intellectual and cultural history?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's the question that I'm really trying to work through. I have Khan Singh Nabha's Mahan Kosh here in my bookshelf, and it's really interesting to see if there are any kinds of transformations at work in, say, the definition of mazhab or Sikh itself. And it's a really demanding project in many ways. It involves kind of a sense of nuance, a sense of locality, of minute transformations that spell big changes at a political level. But you can see that there's maybe, I think, there may be just a few things worth pointing out that I think are already kind of there in the scholarly literature around this era. One is thinking about how to deal with plurality, right? It's fairly clear that we have a really pluralistic tradition or set of traditions which have various kinds of affinities with each other. And once you start to sort of think about categories of religion, that plurality is somewhat undermined. And so that's one impact, right? A kind of undoing of plurality and even practices of pluralism. And that's something that we can maybe explore together. Another would be thinking, about what the kind of new hegemony is that's emergent within these contexts. What are the kinds of, what's the new game in town, right? We see this, metaphor used, say in the beginning of Satyajit Ray's, chess players. There's a new kind of way of playing chess. The old way is obsolete. And something of that sort, you can start to imagine, like the various figures that are becoming apprised of the workings of the colonial regime, understand that a new game is in town. You have to mobilize. You have to mobilize in ways that might undermine that kind of pluralism that I mentioned. And only by sort of mobilizing that fashion, can you gain something like a kind of credence or credibility among colonial authorities? And of course, that's something worth observing. Some of the other things that Mundere talks about is these kinds of divides that are setting in. For Sikh reformists, this quest to extricate themselves from the negative stereotype of contemporary Hinduism was inextricably connected with Trump's thesis that Sikhs, according to the testimony of their own scriptures, were Hindus, and that they shared ideologically, theologically, and ontologically a Hindu time and space. Trump's work served to accentuate the crisis for reformist Sikhs, leading them to articulate their search for identity with questions like, were Sikhs Hindus? If not, what in fact were they? How could they provide evidence which would demonstrate what they claimed? On what basis could they redraw cultural boundaries that had become blurred? So you see that the new kind of game in town sort of, really throws up all sorts of quandaries about who one is, what one's sort of mode of identification ought to be. And this is something like, the slow, gradual process of a new kind of hegemony seeping in through all the various pores and reconstructing various sorts of realms, arenas even of everyday life in accordance with what is most influential, predominant at the helm. So I don't really have that great of an answer for you, but I just wanted to throw out what were what some of the problematics are that we're faced with. I can kind of go into that a little bit more, but that might be enough for the moment.
I'd like to see if there are any other questions here or with anybody else out there connected via Zoom. Any questions here in the class? Well, since we have a few minutes, maybe you could, for a few minutes, just to expand a little bit more on the way that Sikhs responded to this moment. There's an implication that after this moment, there are no other choices but to embrace a very specific definition of religion. And are there traces amongst Sikhs or others of the time period, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, who resist that that trap? And how then is Sikhism defined? What are the spaces in which Sikhism lives outside of those definitions that are being put together in the moment of Ernst Trump?
That's a great question, and this would take some effort to figure out. But you sense that there may be sort of realms of subalternity that are not in accordance with the kinds of new hegemonic forces. And this actually brings into, in some sense, it brings out some of the lacuna within subaltern studies, which never really went into philology, had a kind of distance from even categories of caste as became, apparent, in later moments of that tradition of historiography. And so you're left actually with maybe a lack of kind of theoretical paradigms to work with. And this is what made me kind of want to go, searching through Benjamin, Gramsci, and even Vico to sort of think what would be, an approach that would lay bare or provide some indices of fields that didn't fall under the hegemony of a kind of Trumpian set of categories or reformism that operated more or less in accord with those categories. And there you might sort of see that there may be people who are at odds with this definition of religion, and who might want to kind of keep intact some strains of, say, critique of religion that we see in the, you know, works of various kinds of tantric figures, such as Kabir, and you know, that sort of set of movements that went against the grain of you know, standard, you know, Brahmanical Hinduism, whether there were sort of remnants that defied these sorts of categorizations from the ground up, right? And we're always kind of at odds with the kinds of definitions that enclose people into categories that were sort of like, in some sense, you know, iron cages. And that's something that would take some time. It would be more, I think, at the level of practice. We see maybe a resistance against, you know, these kinds of categorizations. You know, when you go to India, you can sort of occasionally come across like carpenters and figures from within the sort of subaltern castes who don't seem to really, you know, buy into the projects of their, you know, so-called superiors, and but then are maybe willy-nilly caught, you know, in the crossfire, and maybe even kind of forced to choose sides on certain occasions against their own sort of better judgment. And those sorts of situations, I think, are worth really observing and thinking through. There may be a kind of alternative Weltanschauung, you know, worldview among the subalterns within the Punjab, at odds with the reformist currents. Wonder if there are any other, I mean, some of this stuff may be a bit controversial, but
any other thoughts, any questions? In particular about reformism, which is part of the context here to understand. Trump's translation becomes, I think, the site upon which all sorts of things occur in the late 19th century. And by the time of the Khalsa College, we have something coherent, we have something tangible. Any other thoughts on this topic? Yes, Neha.
So should I?
Sure.
Okay. I have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering, were there other British colonial administrators who were also involved in translating the
yes,
text?
this is actually a little bit understudied too, among, you know, all the Orientalists who made such huge impacts on, say, Indian cultural history. Those that you know, make their appearance in the Punjab are like the least studied. There's McAuliffe, M.A. McAuliffe's 6-volume work, which is done in conjunction with, say, the members of the Singh Sabha in the decades just after Trump's passing, and just in the wake of the publication of these works, the Adi Granth and so forth. And so those are, they actually want to figure out a way beyond Trump. And what Mander is talking about is how Trump sort of unleashes a bit of a poison, as it were, where even if you're trying to kind of work your way out of his framework, you're in some sense compelled to imbibe, you know, his general scheme. And so it still sort of has a kind of presence, even if it's resisted. And we might sort of argue, you know, think about what those sort of alternatives were, and what sorts of alternatives may even exist beyond that, you know, beyond, say, the conjoining of forces of Orientalists and religious reformers? Is there another sort of horizon of possibility beyond that? This is my interest in philology, because it seems to always kind of ask that question. Is there another kind of set of possibilities that are being ignored or even negated, purposefully undone? And but yeah, so that's a good question, because it kind of brings up what happened in the wake of Trump. What were the other sort of modes of engagement that were kind of, in a sense, quasi-apologia about Orientalism? There seems to be a kind of operation at work where Orientalist authority and reforming kind of zeal are brought together, and that sort of is, opening up a chapter of this kind of modern hegemony. That was a really good question. I think you can see that a lot of research needs to be done. Once you sort of scratch the surface a little bit, you sense that you don't really have too much to rest upon in terms of already existing scholarship for the points of view that you might be exploring. So you're left really as a kind of pioneer. If you're reading stuff that's already been read and maybe kind of hinted at, no one has really done the kind of fine-toothed critical work that would sort of draw out certain implications that are maybe less recognized in the scholarship.
On that note, I'm just going to have to say we're just about at time, but one of the facets that this discussion has reminded us about the history of the 19th century is how the Punjab is, at one level, somewhat exceptional. Some of the issues that you raised and some of the issues inherent in the study of Sikhism of the time show how it works a bit differently than it had worked in other parts of India. And the limit of Sikhism provides a different view in to India and Indian religion than many other sites of Orientalism had, and other sites of translation and relationships with language. But one thing that you mentioned that we've covered a bit in this class is how so many Indian actors were involved in the reshaping of these traditions. The Singh Sabhas, for example, and many other Indian individuals and institutions worked very hard to also reshape all of these ideas into something new. And I think that's one point that I think we'll have to leave this with. And because we are at time, thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you to everybody out there who has logged in. I'll just ask Molly to stay on for just a few minutes, as those who have left, if they need to leave, they can leave now, and I'll just have a few words for the students. Thank you very much.